Margaret Fowler clutched her twin babies tighter as the stagecoach rattled toward its final destination, a knot of dread growing in her stomach with each mile. The letter tucked inside her coat pocket held a promise that she now feared would be broken, but she had nowhere else to turn. Alta, Utah, 1875, a silver mining town nestled high in the Wasatch Mountains, would either be her salvation or her undoing. "Last stop, Alta," the driver called down as the coach began to slow. Margaret looked down at her sleeping 4-month-old twins, Emma with her rosy cheeks and Samuel with his father's eyes. Their father, the man who had promised to marry her after getting her with child back in St. Louis, had died of typhoid before they could wed, leaving her reputation in tatters. With no family willing to support an unwed mother, she'd been forced to answer a mail-order bride advertisement from a man named Gerald Wilson in this remote mining town. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of a dusty street lined with wooden buildings. Margaret gathered her meager belongings while balancing one baby on her hip and the other in a sling across her chest. "Need help with those little ones, madam?" the driver asked as he opened the door. "Thank you," Margaret said, passing him Emma while she adjusted Samuel in the sling. As she stepped down onto Utah soil, she scanned the small gathering of onlookers, searching for the face that matched the daguerreotype Gerald had sent. A tall, severe-looking man with a neatly trimmed beard stepped forward, his expression darkening as his gaze fell upon the infants. "Miss Fowler?" he asked, his voice cold. "Mr. Wilson," Margaret confirmed, forcing a smile. "I'm pleased to finally meet you." Gerald Wilson made no move to help her with her bags or the baby. Instead, he stared at the twins with unmistakable disgust. "You didn't mention children in your letters." Margaret's heart sank. I thought I had made that clear. I'm sorry for any misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Gerald's voice rose, drawing the attention of passers-by. "I agreed to marry a woman who could help run my mercantile, not a woman burdened with 2 squalling infants." Heat flushed Margaret's face as whispers rippled through the small crowd. "Sir, if you would just give us a chance, I want no part of this," Gerald interrupted, backing away. "The arrangement is off. Find yourself another husband or go back where you came from." He turned and stalked away, leaving Margaret standing alone with her babies and luggage in the middle of the street. Panic welled up inside her. She had spent nearly every penny she had on the journey west. There would be no going back to St. Louis. "Mr. Wilson." She called, desperation edging her voice, but he disappeared into his store without looking back. A woman passing by clucked her tongue. Shameful, turning away a mother and her babies. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as Emma began to fuss. The altitude made the air thin, and the September chill cut through her traveling clothes. What was she to do now? "Looks like you could use some help, madam." Margaret turned to see a tall man approaching. His clothes were dusty from the trail-worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a weathered brown hat that shaded piercing blue eyes. His face was tanned from the sun, with a strong jaw softened by the kindness in his expression. "I'm Kenan Adams," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard what happened." "That's no way to treat a lady, especially one with little ones." "Margaret Fowler," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. "And yes, it seems I've found myself in quite a predicament." Kenan looked at the babies, then back to her face. "Those are mighty fine-looking young'uns you've got there." Unlike Gerald, there was no judgment in his eyes, just a gentle curiosity and something that looked remarkably like admiration. "Emma and Samuel," Margaret said, a hint of pride breaking through her distress. 4 months old next Tuesday." Kenan nodded, then looked around at the gathering crowd. "Let's get you and these little ones somewhere warm. My sister runs the boarding house just down the street. She'll have room for you while you figure things out." "That's very kind, but I'm afraid I have limited funds," Margaret admitted. Kenan waved off her concern. "Nora won't turn away a woman and her children. Besides, Alta could use some new faces that aren't rough miners or gamblers." He picked up her trunk with ease. "Can you manage the little ones while I carry this?" Margaret nodded, grateful for his help but wary of his intentions. She'd learned the hard way that men's kindness often came with expectations. As they walked down the dirt road, Kenan spoke. I ranch a few miles outside of town, nothing fancy, but it's good grazing land. Come into town once a week for supplies and to check on my sister." "You're a cowboy, then?" Margaret asked. Kenan chuckled. "I suppose that's what folks back east would call me. Out here, I'm just a man trying to make something of himself." They reached a 2-story wooden building with a sign reading Alta House. It was simple but well-maintained, with lace curtains visible in the windows. The door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman with the same striking blue eyes as Kenan. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face brightened with curiosity at the sight of Margaret and the twins. "Kenan Adams, what have you brought to my doorstep?" she asked, though her tone was warm rather than accusatory. "Nora, this is Margaret Fowler and her twins, Emma and Samuel. Margaret, this is my sister, Nora Franklin." "The mail-order bride?" Nora asked, her eyes widening. "Word travels fast in this town. I heard Gerald Wilson was expecting someone, but—" Her gaze fell on the twins and understanding dawned. "Oh, I see, that old goat." "I find myself without accommodation," Margaret said, attempting to maintain her dignity despite her circumstances. Nora's face softened. "Well, you're welcome here. I have a room that should fit you and these precious little ones. Come in before they catch their death in this mountain air." The interior of the boarding house was simple but homely, with a tidy common room and the scent of baking bread filling the air. Nora led them to a small room on the first floor. "It's not much, but it has a bed for you and space for a makeshift crib for the twins," Nora said, bustling about to freshen the linens. "I have some old crates we can line with blankets until something better can be arranged." "Thank you," Margaret said, emotion threatening to overcome her composure. "I don't know how I'll repay your kindness." "We'll figure something out," Nora assured her. "Perhaps you have skills that could be useful around here." "I can sew, cook, and I'm good with numbers," Margaret offered. "I kept the books for my father's carpentry business before." Before she'd fallen for sweet words and empty promises, she thought bitterly. "That's settled then," Kenan said, setting down her trunk. "You can help Nora around the boarding house until you get on your feet." Margaret looked between the siblings, struck by their easy generosity to a stranger. "Why are you helping me?" Kenan's expression grew serious. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I know what it's like to be alone in a new place with responsibilities you didn't ask for but wouldn't trade for anything." There was a story there, Margaret thought, but before she could inquire further, Samuel began to wail, followed quickly by his sister. "They must be hungry," Margaret explained, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I'll leave you to tend to them," Kenan said, moving toward the door. "I'll be in town until tomorrow. Nora, I'll be back for supper if that's all right." "You know you're always welcome," his sister replied. After Kenan left, Nora helped Margaret settle in, bringing water for washing and a rocking chair for feeding the babies. As Margaret nursed Emma, Nora sat on the edge of the bed, seemingly fascinated by the tiny infant. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but what happened to their father?" Nora asked. Margaret hesitated, then decided honesty was best with someone who had shown her such kindness. "He died before we could marry. Typhoid took him within a week of falling ill. By then, I was already expecting, though I didn't know it was twins until later." "I'm sorry," Nora said sincerely. "That must have been difficult." "My family disowned me," Margaret continued, the words spilling out after months of holding them in. "I had nowhere to turn. When I saw Mr. Wilson's advertisement seeking a bride to help with his business, it seemed like providence. Gerald Wilson has always been more concerned with appearances than anything else," Nora said with a sniff of disapproval, "but perhaps it's for the best. He would have made a terrible father." Margaret looked down at Emma's peaceful face as she nursed. "I just want to give them a good life. They deserve that much." "And they shall have it," Nora declared. "Alta may be small, but we look after our own, and as of today, you're one of us." For the first time since arriving, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this unexpected detour was not the disaster it had first appeared to be. That evening, Kenan returned as promised, bringing with him a simple wooden cradle. "It's not fancy," he said, setting it down in Margaret's room. But it should hold both little ones for now. Made it myself a few years back when Nora was expecting her son. Margaret ran her hand over the smooth wood, touched by the gesture. It's perfect, thank you. They shared a simple but hearty supper of beef stew and fresh bread. Margaret learned that Nora was a widow. Her husband had died in a mining accident 2 years prior, leaving her with a son, William, now 5 years old. The boarding house had been her way of supporting herself. Kenan helped me purchase this place, Nora explained. He's always been my protector, even when we were children. Kenan looked embarrassed by the praise. Family takes care of family. And how did you come to be in Alta? Margaret asked him. Came west after the war, Kenan replied, his expression briefly shadowed. Worked cattle drives for a few years, saved every penny until I could buy my own piece of land. It's not much compared to the big spreads down in Texas, but it's mine. Do you manage it alone? Margaret inquired. Have a couple of hands that help out, especially during calving season. But mostly it's just me and my dog, Rusty. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He's probably wondering where I am right about now. As the evening wore on, William took a shine to the twins, peering at them with childlike wonder. Were they born this small? He asked. They've grown quite a bit already, Margaret told him with a laugh. They were even smaller when they were born. Will they play with me when they're bigger? The boy asked hopefully. I'm sure they'd love to, Margaret assured him, her heart warming at the thought of her children having a friend. Later, as Kenan prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the door. I don't know how to thank you properly for your kindness today. No thanks needed, he replied. But I was thinking, there's to be a harvest dance at the church next weekend. If you're settled by then, perhaps you'd like to attend. Might be a good way to meet some of the townspeople. Margaret hesitated. I'm not sure I should with the babies. Nora would watch them, I'm certain. She doesn't get out much herself these days. He adjusted his hat. Just think on it, no pressure. After he left, Margaret returned to her room to find both twins asleep in their new cradle. She sat on the edge of her bed, exhausted from the day's events but too wired to sleep. She removed the crumpled letter from Gerald Wilson from her pocket and read it again. His flowery promises now rang hollow in light of his rejection. Yet if he had welcomed her as agreed, she would never have met the Adams siblings. Perhaps, she thought as she finally lay down to sleep, fate had other plans for her in Alta. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the sounds of the boarding house coming to life, the crackle of a fire being stoked, the clatter of dishes, and William's excited chatter. She quickly tended to the twins, who had mercifully slept for longer stretches than usual, and made her way to the kitchen. Nora was at the stove, frying bacon and eggs for the few boarders who sat at a large table in the adjoining dining room. She looked up as Margaret entered. Good morning. I was just about to check if you were awake. There's coffee in the pot and breakfast will be ready shortly. Can I help? Margaret offered, setting the twins down in the cradle Kenan had brought to the kitchen. If you wouldn't mind setting the table for 2 more. Kenan said he'd stop by before heading back to his ranch. Margaret busied herself with the task, acutely aware of the curious glances from the other boarders, 2 older men who appeared to be minors and a young woman who introduced herself as the schoolteacher, Jane Cooper. We don't get many newcomers in Alta, especially not with little ones, Jane said warmly. If you need anything, my schoolhouse is just down the street. I live in the back room. Thank you, Margaret replied, grateful for another friendly face. A knock at the door announced Kenan's arrival. He entered, bringing with him the crisp morning air and a small package wrapped in brown paper. Morning, ladies, he greeted, removing his hat. His gaze landed on Margaret and his smile widened. Sleep well, better than expected, she answered honestly. The twins only woke twice. Must be the mountain air, he said, then handed her the package. This is for the little ones, thought they might need it. Margaret unwrapped the parcel to find 2 small knitted caps in soft blue and pink yarn. These are lovely, Mr. Adams, did you? Kenan laughed, a rich sound that filled the kitchen. Lord, no, my hands are good for roping calves and mending fences, not fine work like that. Got them from Mrs. Holloway at the general store. She's always knitting something or other. Still, it was thoughtful, thank you. Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot coffee she'd just sipped. Nora served breakfast, and conversation flowed easily around the table. The miners, brothers named Robert and Thomas Quinn, regaled them with tales from the silver mines, while Jane spoke of her challenges teaching children of various ages in one small schoolhouse. "Maybe you could help at the school sometimes, Margaret," Jane suggested. "We have a few young mothers in town who might appreciate knowing there's someone reliable who could mind their little ones occasionally." "That's not a bad idea," Nora agreed. "You could use my front parlor. It's hardly used except on Sundays when the preacher comes to call. A nursery of sorts." Margaret considered the possibility. It would be a way to contribute to her keep while caring for her own children. "Seems you're already finding your place," Kenan observed, his blue eyes twinkling with approval. After breakfast, as he prepared to leave, Kenan invited Margaret to walk out with him. The morning was bright, with sunlight gleaming off the mountains that surrounded the town. "I was thinking," Kenan said as they stood on the porch, "I've got a cow that's giving more milk than I can use. If you'd like, I could bring some each time I come to town, good for the little ones when they're ready for it." "That's very generous," Margaret said, touched by his consideration. Kenan shrugged. "Just being neighborly. Besides," he glanced back at the boarding house. "Nora seems happier with you here. She's been lonely since James died." "She's been very kind to me," Margaret said. "I don't know what I would have done without her help and yours." "Have you given any thought to the harvest dance?" Kenan asked, changing the subject. "It's a week from Saturday." Margaret hesitated. "I'm not sure it would be proper given my circumstances." Kenan's expression grew serious. "Margaret, I don't know what things were like where you come from, but out here, folks judge you by your character, not your past. You're a mother doing her best for her children." "There's nothing improper about that." His words eased something that had been tight in her chest since leaving St. Louis. "Then yes, I think I would like to attend." Kenan's smile returned. "Good, I'll come by to escort you at 7. He placed his hat back on his head. "Until then, Miss Fowler." Margaret watched him walk away, a tall figure against the backdrop of the mountains. There was something solid about Kenan Adams, something reliable that she hadn't encountered in a man before. Over the next week, Margaret settled into life at the boarding house. True to her word, Nora helped set up the front parlor as a small nursery, and Jane Cooper spread the word among the young mothers of Alta. By the end of the week, Margaret had 3 children to look after for a few hours each day, in addition to her own twins. The extra income, modest though it was, gave her a sense of independence she hadn't felt since before her father disowned her. She began to see a future in Alta, not the one she had planned, but perhaps a better one. Kenan visited twice that week, bringing milk as promised and staying for supper. Margaret found herself looking forward to his visits, enjoying his stories of ranch life and the quiet way he listened when she spoke of her hopes and fears. The night of the harvest dance arrived clear and cool. Margaret stood before the small mirror in her room, smoothing the front of her best dress, a deep blue gown that she had taken in to fit her post-pregnancy figure. It was simple compared to what other women might wear, but it was clean and well-made. "You look beautiful," Nora said from the doorway. She held Samuel in her arms while William carefully rocked Emma in the chair by the window. "Kenan won't know what hit him." Margaret blushed. "It's not like that, he's just being kind." Nora raised an eyebrow. "My brother is kind to many people, but he doesn't look at them the way he looks at you." Before Margaret could respond, there was a knock at the front door. Heart suddenly racing, she took one last look in the mirror, tucked a stray curl back into place, and went to greet her escort. Kenan stood in the entryway, looking remarkably different in clean trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a dark vest. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly shaved for the occasion. In his hands, he held a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers. "Miss Fowler," he said, his voice catching slightly, "you look, well, you're a sight for sore eyes." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you, Mr. Adams, you clean up rather nicely yourself." He handed her the flowers. "These aren't much compared to what you might find in a city, but they're the prettiest ones I could find." "They're lovely," Margaret said, genuinely touched. She hadn't received flowers since her courting days with the twins' father. After assuring herself that Nora had everything she needed for the twins, Margaret took Kenan's offered arm, and they set off toward the church at the end of the main street. The harvest dance was a simple affair by St. Louis standards, but there was a warmth and community spirit that Margaret found instantly appealing. Lanterns hung from the rafters of the church's meeting hall, casting a golden glow over the festivities. A small group of musicians played lively tunes, and tables laden with food and drink lined one wall. Kenan introduced her to what seemed like the entire town: the sheriff and his wife, the blacksmith, the doctor, several ranchers and their families, and miners like the Quinn brothers who boarded with Nora. To Margaret's surprise, most were welcoming, though she noticed a few disapproving glances from some of the older women. "Don't mind Mrs. Peterson and her friends," Kenan murmured as he led her to the refreshment table. "They disapprove of everyone on principle." Margaret laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "In St. Louis, I wouldn't have been allowed through the door of any respectable gathering." "Then St. Louis's loss is Alta's gain," Kenan said firmly, handing her a cup of punch. The musicians struck up a waltz, and Kenan set down his cup. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Fowler?" Margaret hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Adams." As they moved onto the dance floor, Margaret was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, strong and sure. It had been so long since she danced or felt the simple pleasure of being in a man's arms without complication or consequence. "You're a fine dancer," she commented as he guided her smoothly through the steps. "Had a good teacher." "My mother insisted her children learn proper manners despite our frontier upbringing." His expression softened at the mention of his mother. "She would have liked you, is she?" "Passed 5 years ago, pneumonia." His grip tightened slightly. "Our father died in the war, so it was just Nora and me after that. We came west together." "You've done well for yourselves," Margaret observed. "A ranch, a boarding house, that's no small accomplishment." "We've been fortunate," Kenan agreed, "but it hasn't been without its struggles." As the evening progressed, they danced several more times, with Margaret accepting a few dances from other men to be polite. Each time, she found her gaze drifting back to Kenan, who watched her with an intensity that made her both nervous and exhilarated. During a break in the music, they stepped outside for some air. The night was clear, with stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on velvet. "It's beautiful here," Margaret said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. "So different from St. Louis. There, the buildings block most of the sky, and the air is thick with smoke from the factories." "I've never been to a big city," Kenan admitted. "Always figured I'd find it too confining." "It can be," Margaret agreed. "But there are advantages: 2 theaters, libraries, shops with goods from all over the world." "Do you miss it?" Kenan asked, studying her face in the moonlight. Margaret considered the question. "I miss certain aspects, the convenience, the familiarity. But I don't miss the judgment, the rigid rules about what's proper and what isn't." She looked up at him. "Here, I feel like I can breathe." Kenan's expression softened. "I'm glad to hear that. I was worried you might find Alta too small, too provincial after city life." "On the contrary," Margaret said with a smile, "I think it might be exactly what I need." They fell into a comfortable silence, standing side by side, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "Margaret," Kenan said finally, his voice low, "I hope you don't think I'm being forward, but I've enjoyed your company these past days, more than I expected to." Margaret's heart quickened. "I've enjoyed yours as well. I was wondering if I might call on you properly, not just as a friend or a neighbor, but—" He cleared his throat. "With intentions." The directness of his request took her by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Kenan Adams was not a man who played games or spoke in riddles. "Kenan," she began carefully, "I'm flattered, truly, but you must understand my situation. I have 2 small children. Any man who courts me courts them as well." "I'm well aware of that," he said steadily. "Emma and Samuel are part of who you are. I wouldn't have it any other way." Margaret searched his face for any sign of reservation or uncertainty, but found none. "Then yes, you may call on me. But let's not rush, for the children's sake, if nothing else." Kenan's smile was like the sunrise, gradual but transformative. I'm a patient man, Margaret Fowler. I've waited 30 years to find someone worth courting. I can wait a little longer to do it right. As they rejoined the dance, Margaret felt a sense of possibility unfurling within her. It was tentative, fragile as a new leaf, but it was there the hope that perhaps in this unlikely place she had found not just refuge but a new beginning. The days following the harvest dance took on a rhythm that Margaret found both comforting and exciting. Her small nursery business grew, with 6 children now regularly under her care during the day. The income, combined with her arrangement to help Nora with the cooking and cleaning at the boarding house, meant she was able to pay her way and even set aside a small amount each week. Kenan was true to his word about calling on her properly. Every Sunday after church, he would appear at the boarding house, freshly shaved and wearing his best clothes, often bearing small gifts: a jar of honey from a neighbor's hives, a carved wooden horse for Samuel, a ribbon for Emma's hair. They would take walks through town when weather permitted, sometimes with the twins bundled up in a small wagon Kenan had fashioned. Other times, Nora would watch the babies while they enjoyed a private supper at Alta's only restaurant, a simple establishment run by a French-Canadian couple who had come to the mountains during the Silver Rush. As October gave way to November, the mountains received their first dusting of snow, a harbinger of the harsh winter to come. Margaret worried about Kenan traveling between his ranch and town once the deep snows arrived. "The pass can get treacherous," Nora confirmed one evening as they prepared supper. "Most years, Kenan stays in town with me for at least part of the winter. His ranch hands look after the cattle. I wouldn't want him taking unnecessary risks," Margaret said, trying to sound casual. Nora smiled knowingly. "He seems to think you're worth the risk. I've never seen my brother so smitten." Margaret busied herself with kneading bread dough to hide her blush. "He's been very kind," Nora laughed. "Margaret, the man is in love with you. Surely you can see that." In truth, Margaret had begun to hope that might be the case, though she was cautious about admitting her own growing feelings. Her previous experience had taught her that love could be fleeting and promises easily broken. Yet Kenan was different from the twins' father in every way that mattered. Where Peter had been charming and impulsive, Kenan was steady and thoughtful. Where Peter had made grand gestures but struggled with day-to-day reliability, Kenan showed his character in consistent actions rather than words. Most importantly, Kenan adored the twins. He would sit patiently with Samuel, who was colicky and fussed more than his sister, rocking him and singing old trail songs in a surprisingly melodious baritone. He fashioned toys for them: a rattle made from smooth wood, a stuffed cloth horse filled with dried beans that Emma loved to grasp. "They're going to be heartbreakers one day," he told Margaret as they sat by the fire one Sunday evening, the twins asleep in their cradle nearby. "Samuel with those serious eyes and Emma with that smile, you'll be beating suitors away with a stick." "That's a long way off, thankfully," Margaret replied, smiling at the thought. "I'm more concerned with getting them through their first winter. The doctor says they're thriving, but the altitude and cold worry me." "Dr. Jenkins is the best in 3 counties, Kenan assured her. "And you're doing an amazing job with them, Margaret. Don't sell yourself short." His faith in her bolstered her confidence in ways she hadn't expected. Having spent months believing herself a failure, first for succumbing to Peter's seduction, then for being unable to secure a marriage that would provide for her children, Kenan's unwavering support was like water to parched soil. The first major snowfall came in late November, blanketing Alta in 3 feet of snow overnight. Margaret awoke to find the world transformed into a glistening white wonderland, beautiful but daunting. Kenan arrived at the boarding house just after breakfast, his coat and hat covered in snow. "Wanted to make sure you were all set before the next storm hits," he explained, stomping his boots at the door. "Weather like this can isolate us for days." "We're well provisioned," Nora assured him. "Margaret and I canned enough vegetables to last the winter, and the root cellar is full." "Good," Kenan nodded. "I've decided to move into town for a few weeks. Jenkins says there's another storm building that could drop twice this much snow. Left instructions with my foreman about the cattle." You'll stay here, of course, Nora said. It wasn't a question. If you have the room, Kenan agreed, his eyes finding Margaret's. She felt a flutter of anticipation at the thought of having him close by. The twins and I have been taking up the best guest room. Perhaps we should move upstairs to give you more privacy. Nonsense, Kenan said. The back room will suit me fine. It's not like I haven't stayed there before. With Kenan in residence, the boarding house took on a cozy, familial atmosphere. In the evenings, after the other boarders had retired and the twins were asleep, the three adults would gather in the parlor. Nora would mend or knit, while Kenan read aloud from one of the few books in the house, mostly dime novels and a well-worn Bible. Margaret treasured these quiet hours, watching Kenan's strong hands turn the pages, listening to his voice rise and fall with the narrative. Sometimes their eyes would meet over the top of the book, and the look they exchanged spoke volumes without a word being uttered. One evening, as Christmas approached, Nora excused herself early, claiming fatigue. Once she had gone upstairs, a new awareness settled between Margaret and Kenan. Alone together in the parlor, with only the crackling fire for company, the air seemed charged with possibility. I should check on the twins, Margaret said, more to break the tension than from actual necessity. Of course, Kenan replied, setting aside his book. She slipped into her room, where the twins slept peacefully in their cradle. Standing over them, she felt a surge of love so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. These precious little beings depended on her completely. Any decision she made would affect their lives as well as her own. When she returned to the parlor, Kenan had moved to stand by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered street. He turned as she entered, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and serious, "there's something I need to say." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I know we agreed to take things slowly, and I respect that, but these past weeks—" He took a step toward her. "Being here with you and the twins, seeing you every day, it's made me certain of what I want." Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "And what is that?" "A life with you," he said simply. "All three of you. I want to be a father to Emma and Samuel. I want to be a husband to you. I know I'm just a cowboy with a small ranch, not some wealthy city gentleman, but everything I have, everything I am, is yours if you'll have me." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Kenan Adams, you are more of a gentleman than any man I've ever known. And the twins already love you almost as much as I do." His face lit up at her words. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," she confirmed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But I have one condition." "Name it," he said without hesitation. "I want the twins to have your name legally. I want them to grow up as Adams, not Fowler." Kenan closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "I would be honored to give them my name. They'll be my children in every way that matters." He leaned down slowly, giving her ample time to step back if she wished. But Margaret had no desire to retreat. When his lips met hers, it felt like coming home after a long journey. His kiss was gentle yet firm, a promise of devotion without demands. When they finally parted, Kenan rested his forehead against hers. "I should speak to Reverend Wallace tomorrow. See when he can perform the ceremony." "There's no rush," Margaret said, though her heart disagreed. "The passes will be snowed in until spring. We have time." "I've wasted enough time in my life," Kenan replied, brushing a curl from her face. "I don't intend to waste any more." "Unless you need more time," Margaret shook her head. "No, I'm ready for this new beginning." They were married 2 weeks later in the Alta church, with snow falling gently outside the windows. Margaret wore a simple cream-colored dress that Nora had helped her make, with sprigs of pine and dried berries in her hair in place of flowers. Emma and Samuel, dressed in their best clothes, were held by Nora and Jane Cooper during the brief ceremony. "I, Kenan James Adams, take thee, Margaret Elizabeth Fowler, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Kenan's voice rang clear in the small church. "I promise to love and cherish you and your children as my own, to protect and provide for you all the days of my life." Margaret's own vows were spoken through tears of joy. When Reverend Wallace pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering of townsfolk erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration continued at the boarding house, where Nora had prepared a feast with the help of several women from town. There was roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and a small cake decorated with preserved summer berries. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself in a quiet corner with her new husband, watching as their guests laughed and talked. "Happy, Mrs. Adams?" Kenan asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "If you had told me 3 months ago that I would be here, married to a wonderful man who loves my children as his own, I wouldn't have believed it." "Life has a way of surprising us," Kenan said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "When I rode into town that day, I certainly wasn't expecting to find my future wife and children waiting for me." "And yet you didn't hesitate," Margaret marveled. "When Gerald rejected us, you stepped forward." Kenan's expression grew thoughtful. "I knew the moment I saw you standing there with those babies that you were something special. And when I heard Wilson say he wanted none of you, all I could think was that I wanted you all." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her like a warm tide. "And now you have us." "Best decision I ever made," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. After the guests had departed and the twins were asleep in what was now their family bedroom, Kenan and Margaret stood together in the privacy of their new quarters. The simple iron bed had been decked with fresh linens, and someone, probably Nora, had placed a small bunch of pine branches in a jar on the dresser, filling the room with their fragrance. There was a moment of shy hesitation between them, the newness of their intimacy suddenly apparent. Margaret had known a man before, but this was different. This was her husband, a man she had chosen with clear eyes and an open heart. "I'm not expecting anything tonight," Kenan said softly, sensing her nervousness. "We can just sleep if you prefer." Margaret shook her head, reaching for the buttons at the back of her dress. "No, I want this, I want you, it's been a while." Kenan stepped forward to help her with the buttons, his fingers gentle against her back. "We have all the time in the world, Margaret, there's no rush." With each layer of clothing removed, Margaret felt herself shedding the constraints and judgments of her past. Here, with this man who had claimed her and her children as his own, she was not a fallen woman or a shameful secret. She was simply a wife, desired and cherished. When they finally came together, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Kenan's love was expressed in every touch, every whispered word of admiration. He treated her body like a precious gift, finding joy in her pleasure. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, Margaret listened to the steady beat of his heart and knew she had found her true home. Spring came late to Alta, with snow lingering in shaded areas well into April. By then, Margaret and the twins had moved to Kenan's ranch, a sturdy log house nestled in a valley about 5 miles from town. It was modest but well built, with a large kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The land around the house was coming alive with new-growth tender grass pushing through the melting snow, wildflowers beginning to bud, aspens showing the first hint of green. The cattle, thin from the harsh winter but healthy, grazed in the lower meadows under the watchful eyes of Kenan and his 2 ranch hands, Miguel and Jacob. Margaret quickly settled into ranch life, establishing a vegetable garden as soon as the ground thawed enough to work. The twins, now 10 months old, were crawling everywhere, keeping her constantly on her toes. Samuel had Kenan's determined nature, while Emma was more cautious but equally curious. Life had a rhythm that suited Margaret up with the dawn to prepare breakfast for Kenan and the hands, tending to the twins and the house through the morning, working in the garden or with the chickens Kenan had acquired for her in the afternoon. In the evening, she would sit on the porch with the twins, watching for Kenan's return from whatever part of the ranch had claimed his attention that day. The sight of him riding toward home, tall in the saddle with his hat pulled low against the sun, never failed to make her heart skip. He would dismount in one fluid motion, hand the reins to whoever was nearby, and stride toward her with a smile that was hers alone. "There's my family," he would say, gathering them all in his arms. On Sundays, they would make the trip to town for church and to visit Nora, who doted on her niece and nephew as if they were her own. William had appointed himself their official protector, solemnly informing Margaret that he would teach them everything they needed to know when they were big enough. It was during one such Sunday visit in early May that Margaret first suspected she might be expecting again. The familiar fatigue and queasiness were unmistakable, though she kept her suspicions to herself until she was certain. A week later, as they lay in bed with moonlight streaming through the window, she turned to face Kenan. "I have something to tell you." He propped himself up on one elbow, his expression concerned. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "Not wrong," Margaret assured him, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat abdomen. "But our family may be growing sooner than we expected." Kenan's eyes widened, then filled with such joy that Margaret felt her own eyes welling with tears. "A baby, our baby." She nodded, laughing as he gathered her close, his enthusiasm contagious. "Due around Christmas, by my calculations." "A Christmas baby," he marveled, his hand still resting protectively over her womb. "The twins will be what, 18 months by then? That's good timing. You're happy then?" Margaret asked, though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Kenan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love Emma and Samuel as my own, you know that, but the thought of a child we created together." He shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. "I know," Margaret whispered, leaning in to kiss him. "I feel the same way." As her pregnancy progressed through the summer and fall, Margaret bloomed. Unlike her first pregnancy, which had been shadowed by uncertainty and shame, this one was celebrated openly. Kenan was attentive to her every need, ensuring she didn't overexert herself while respecting her desire to maintain her independence. The twins continued to thrive, taking their first steps in July and adding new words to their vocabulary almost daily. Papa was among their favorites, and Kenan never tired of hearing it, even when it was shouted at full volume at 5 in the morning. In September, as Margaret entered her 6th month, a letter arrived from St. Louis. It was from her younger sister, Caroline, breaking years of silence. She wrote that their father had died, and in his final days he had expressed regret for his harsh treatment of Margaret. Caroline, now married herself, wanted to re-establish contact with her sister and meet her niece and nephew. Margaret read the letter with mixed emotions: grief for the father she had loved despite his rejection, relief that he had found some peace before his death, hope that she might reconnect with at least one member of her family. "Will you write back?" Kenan asked as they sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "I think so," Margaret said, leaning against his solid presence. Caroline was always kind, even when she couldn't openly defy father. "And I'd like the children to know they have family back east, even if we can't visit often." "We could, you know," Kenan said thoughtfully. "Visit, I mean, not right away with the new baby coming, but perhaps next year or the year after." "I've never seen the Mississippi, and I'd like to meet your sister." Margaret looked up at him, once again struck by his generosity of spirit. "You wouldn't mind," Kenan chuckled. "Margaret, you gave up everything to come west." "The least I can do is accompany you back east for a visit someday." She pressed a kiss to his jaw, rough with the day's stubble. "Have I told you lately how much I love you, Kenan Adams?" "Not in the last few hours," he teased, pulling her closer. "Well, I do, more than I ever thought possible." The baby arrived 2 weeks early, on a cold December night with snow falling thick and fast outside. Dr. Jenkins had been summoned from town earlier in the day when Margaret's pains began, and Nora had come to look after the twins. The labor was shorter but more intense than with the twins, and shortly before midnight, Margaret gave birth to a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. "He's perfect," Kenan whispered, cradling his son with a tenderness that made Margaret's heart swell. "Absolutely perfect." They named him James Kenan Adams after Kenan's father and himself. Little James had a powerful set of lungs and a determined expression that made Dr. Jenkins laugh. "He knows his own mind already," the doctor observed, "going to be a strong one like his father." The next morning, Nora brought the twins in to meet their new brother. Emma approached cautiously, her brown eyes wide with curiosity. Samuel was more direct, immediately trying to touch the baby's tiny fingers. Baby, Emma said solemnly, looking to Margaret for confirmation. That's right, sweetheart, Margaret affirmed. This is your baby brother, James, my baby, Samuel declared, causing the adults to laugh. Our baby, Kenan corrected gently. He belongs to all of us, just like you and Emma belong to all of us. Watching her 3 children together for the first time, with Kenan's arm around her shoulders and Nora beaming from the doorway, Margaret was overwhelmed by a sense of completeness. Her journey had been difficult and unexpected, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The ranch prospered under Kenan's careful management, allowing them to build a larger house when their family expanded again with the arrival of daughter Catherine in 1878. The twins grew into bright, capable children who adored their younger siblings and excelled at the small school in Alta. Margaret's nursery business evolved into a proper school for Alta's youngest children, which she ran from a small building Kenan and several other men from town constructed near the main schoolhouse. Her sister Caroline visited from St. Louis when Catherine was born and returned several times over the years, strengthening the bond that had been nearly broken by their father's intransigence. In the summer of 1882, 7 years after Margaret had first stepped off the stagecoach with her infant twins, the Adams family hosted a special celebration at their ranch. Friends and neighbors gathered to witness Kenan and Margaret renew their wedding vows, this time with their 4 children in attendance. Emma and Samuel, now 7 years old, stood proudly beside their parents, with James and Catherine fidgeting nearby under Nora's watchful eye. As Reverend Wallace led them through the familiar words, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought of the frightened young woman she had been, clutching her babies as she faced an uncertain future. She thought of the man who had rejected them and the man who had claimed them as his own. She thought of all the small moments of love and patience that had built this life they now shared. When it was time to speak her vows, Margaret's voice was clear and strong. I, Margaret Adams, reaffirm my love and commitment to you, Kenan. You saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself. You loved my children as your own before they even knew your name. You gave us a home not just of walls and roof, but of acceptance and unwavering love. I vow to continue loving you with the same generosity and faith you have always shown me for all the days of our lives. Kenan's eyes shone with emotion as he responded with his own heartfelt promises. When they sealed their vows with a kiss, their gathered friends and family erupted in cheers and applause. Later, as twilight settled over the mountains and the celebration continued around them, Kenan found Margaret sitting alone on the porch swing, watching their children play with the other young ones from town. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Adams, he said, settling beside her. I was just thinking about fate, Margaret replied, leaning into his familiar warmth. How one moment of rejection led to a lifetime of happiness. Kenan nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. I thank God every day that Gerald Wilson was a fool. Margaret laughed, the sound mingling with the music and chatter from the yard. As do I, though at the time it seemed like the end of the world. And now, Kenan asked, though he knew the answer. Margaret looked out at their home, the ranch house with lights glowing in the windows, the barn where Samuel was currently showing his friends a new calf, the garden where Emma was gathering flowers with Catherine toddling behind her, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. Now, she said, turning to meet her husband's gaze, it feels like our story is just beginning. Kenan leaned in to kiss her, a gesture as familiar as breathing yet still capable of sending a thrill through her. It always will be, he promised. Every day with you and the children is a new page, a new adventure. As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Margaret Fowler Adams knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the love of the man who had looked at a desperate young woman with 2 babies and said, without hesitation, I want them all.